Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference, the final session in the sustainability track. I'm Leah Langby from the IFLIS Library System, and the fabulous Cole Zroslik from the Winding Rivers Library System is with us today. And I'm really excited today to welcome Leah Dudak, who is a PhD student at the Syracuse University and also is representing Urban Libraries Unite. She'll be addressing trauma in public libraries and talking about a study that the Urban Libraries Unite project did. I wanted to mention right off the bat that some of the questions or comments that you have today might be a little bit sensitive. And so there's just two things to note. One is that we are actually going to stop recording when Leah's finished with the formal part of her presentation and when we're moving into the question and answer and discussion part, so that you can feel a little more free to ask questions or make comments. The other thing is that you're welcome to put things in chat, but if you use the Q&A section, that will, and there is an option to make your questions anonymous. So if that would make you feel more comfortable or more happy to share your questions or comments, then please avail yourself of that. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Leah.
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here with me today. So today we're going to be talking about the 2022 Urban Library Trauma Study. And I really want to thank Wild Wisconsin for allowing me to be here today to talk about it with you. So to start with, a little bit about myself. My name is Leah Dudak, as was previously mentioned. I am a partner for the Urban Library Trauma Study. Before getting back to school to look at my PhD, I'm currently working my PhD at the Syracuse iSchool, looking at trauma that public library workers experience. Before that, I worked in libraries for roughly 10 years, libraries of different types, and was a professional librarian at 3 libraries before coming back for my PhD. I'll have this at the end too, but just so y'all have it. Here is my contact information. You can email me. You can find me on Twitter, and there's also my LinkedIn. For anybody who's watching the recording in the future, please feel free to email me or message me on Twitter or LinkedIn if you want to talk or have any questions or comments you'd like to talk about, since that portion of this presentation will not be recorded. I'm happy to talk after this. So just to get started, a little background on what Urban Libraries Unite is. It's a Urban Librarians Unite is. It's a nonprofit professional organization that is focused on library workers, specifically in urban libraries. The main things that what we call ULU does is advocacy. There is an annual conference in September. We have social events, and then we do projects, things like the Urban Library Trauma Study, or ULTS. We also are currently working on a little handout that talks about like what to do if you're having a drag queen story time. We're also applying for more grants to do more work, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So before we get started, I do want to just give a trigger warning. We are talking about trauma today. So if at any point you need to get up, get a drink of water, I talked earlier about how I really like intuitive movement, specifically like punching the air. If that's what you need to do, or if you need to take a fidget toy or knit or whatever, or even leave this webinar and come back to it later, do what you have to do to protect your peace, because this is trauma. And unfortunately, it's things many of us have experienced. And so if it brings up certain feelings for you, please give yourself time to process those and move through them in whatever way is healthy for you. So just to start with, librarians, we're talking about trauma a lot more as kind of a group. I also think as a culture with COVID-19, we're talking about trauma a bit more, but I do kind of want to lay a baseline for what I personally define as trauma. I really like the substance abuse and mental health services definition. That basically says that trauma is something that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, their mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. The big thing I also want to stress is this can happen to anyone, and it can be triggered by a variety of things. One might be traumatic to one, might not to another. It is a very individual thing. While it also is kind of like a universal experience, a lot of people experience trauma at some point in their life. Also, I want to talk about, I feel like a lot of times we minimize mental health by saying it's just in your head. However, I do also want to say that trauma can actually change your body, like at the gene level. It is a full body reaction. It can impact, you know, your digestive system, it can impact your immune system, all these things. So while it does, you know, it is kind of a psychological response, it does affect the whole body, and it's worth being valued and trusted just like any other bodily well-being. So to start with, what is the Urban Library Trauma Study? So this was an IMLS funded grant that we applied for in 2021. The project was done between 2021 and 2022, and it wrapped with the release of our study in June 2022. After the release, we sent out physical copies to state libraries along with directors of major public library systems. There also is a full report on the ULU website, which I'm also gonna put in the chat. So there's that. We also have other things on our website you can check out. So I just encourage you to look at that. Well, this might be kind of a silly question, especially if this is something you've experienced. There are many people who ask, why are we studying this? We're studying this because this is happening and our system is failing library workers at all levels, and it's failing our communities. You know, I think many people notice an uptick of this with COVID-19. And the continued pandemic. And also, libraries are not always what the public thinks them to be. So this is also a way to kind of disrupt that narrative. As one of the great groups that we had in their trauma study said, you can't self-care your way out of a broken system. So why do we keep trying to put the onus on the individual rather than looking at the system? You know, as librarians, we do our best, but we aren't superheroes. We're still people who have bodies and have responses. And I basically also just want to take a little time to thank everyone who shared with us during this process. We had surveys that we did, we had interviews, and then we had the final trauma forum, which I'll talk about. We had all these people who shared their stories with us, and I feel very blessed to be able to carry that and to share that with you today. So this is kind of our process of how we went through this. We started with a literature review in spring 2021. You can find that on the website. And with this, there isn't a lot of discussion about trauma in library fields. So we had to look at adjacent fields. So things like education, social work. For my personal research, I also look at things like health. You kind of have to look outside because there are other fields talking about this in ways that can be directly applied to libraries. It just hasn't hit libraries quite as fully yet. In August 2021, we did a nationwide survey of urban library workers. We collected over 400 usable responses, and these were individuals sharing their stories with us, sharing their experiences, the good and the bad. After that, we invited some of those people to join us for a focus group, which was done virtually with 58 participants of varying job titles and libraries. The varying job titles was important to us because while public service employees are, you know, the front facing staff are often the ones who get it the most. You know, we also did have managers, we had security workers, we had librarians, we had library staff. We tried to have people at all levels because this isn't just a unique instance to one job or one position or one level. Also with the focus groups, which I think was really fun, we also sent care packages to them because as we were asking people to share very vulnerable things, we wanted to make sure that throughout this whole process that people felt cared for. And finally, after all this data collection and all this literature review, it culminated in a forum in March 2022. And it was a live design session with 34 library professionals in a variety of job categories. I was lucky enough to be there for this. It was like a 3-day event in Brooklyn, New York, where we talked about and analyzed and came up with ideas and solutions for the future to kind of start to tackle this topic. So while I am a PhD student, you know, I was a previous librarian, and we really wanted to make sure that this work was grounded in library work for library employees. I also want to stress that this whole project was done through a kind of a design thinking. So this is an iterative process. We're constantly learning, trying new things, and then going back to evaluate and grow. As we continue to develop this project, hopefully through another grant, this will continue to be a core kind of tenet. We're not claiming that the things we know are the end all. We're just trying to do the best with what we have. This process has to keep going. It can't be stagnant because trauma and lived experiences in libraries aren't stagnant. So I do want to give just kind of another trigger warning for the next 3 slides, because there are going to talk about trauma and traumatic experiences. Again, we're not really talking about it in detail quite yet, or really at all today, but it is general. And so if at any point, again, you need to step away, please, please, please do that. So to start with, we have a word cloud. This is some of the words from our survey that we did, which participants self-selected into. We realized that out of our participants, it said it was about over 400, 68.5% of participants had experienced violent or aggressive behavior at their library, and 22% had experienced it from colleagues and coworkers. So we were learning through the survey that issues were stemming from outside the library and inside. There were instances where people felt like library administrators were not backing them up, that libraries were dealing with weapons as a normal thing to have in the library. And a lot of people talked about the long-term stress from not having the power to help or meaningfully intervene in dangerous situations. We also experienced a lot of secondhand trauma, which is secondhand trauma, if you're not aware, is when somebody shares a traumatic experience with you, that can cause kind of a secondary traumatic effect. So if somebody's telling you about something terrible that happened, you know, that does impact you. And the main thing that was pointed out from the survey that respondents wanted most and thought would help most was a supportive work environment. So from this, what we have found is that kind of piecing together some studies and mostly a lot of articles, news articles about things that have happened to library staff. There are things that acknowledge the problem going back as far as 1984, although I would argue this problem goes back before that, which I'm trying to figure out a way to prove that. Societal issues are finding their ways into libraries, and there's not really support for library staff who are dealing with it. Again, the most requested thing was a supportive work environment, and the focus groups, the participants even talked that just an acknowledgement from staff would be really helpful as a way to recover. With this focus group too, many people felt like that was only happening to them and that they should be able to control their feelings without external support. I do think this is changing as we're talking about it more and more, but I still feel, I know when I was in libraries experiencing things, I thought I was the only one having problems. We also talked about, you know, in the focus group, things like sexual assault being rampant was mentioned, harassment from not only patrons, but also from board members, supervisors, other staff. Racial abuse was found common in libraries and often ignored by white colleagues and management. A lot of times there wasn't a lot of guidelines for how to deal with things, especially all these societal failings that are pressing in at libraries and causing stress. There was also this acknowledgement that libraries can be this great force for good, but then having to take on all those needs can be stressful. And so how do you balance that? And then also just how, you know, high need patrons bring in their trauma. They're often not the problem, but abusive patrons are. So kind of that idea of intentionality. The last thing that I think was brought up that I think is interesting is that this kind of idea of this customer service idea we have that the customer is always right allows for this incivility towards library staff and allows for library staff to potentially be traumatized. So from our focus group, we developed something that we're calling the library trauma cycle. So the library trauma cycle starts first with an outside stressor, which is an adverse event to a staff member. So it can be a variety of things, you know, including but not limited to things like assault, sexual harassment, verbal abuse, racialized abuse, witnessing violence, workplace bullying, you know, witnessing or assisting with a health incident, secondary trauma, etc. So once you have that outside stressor, if that outside stressor is not dealt with in a way that feels good, then it moves into this professional community response. So this is the response or lack of response from your coworkers, supervisors, administration, and professional community to that stressor situation that you experienced. If you don't get a great community response, then it moves into internalization. So without support, a lot of library workers may feel that they're alone, that they're at fault, and they hold on to that stress. And when they hold on to that stress, that actually comes back and goes to the next outside stressor situation and affects the next situation, either with a patron or even with a coworker. So we have this model for how things can progress. Now, what do we do with it? Well, the thing about a cycle is that it can go forever or it can be broken. So each of these three distinct stages of the trauma cycle is an inflection point where the cycle can be broken. So first, if there's not an outside stressor, the cycle can't start. If people or the library responds well when there is a stressor, it can take the burden off the individual. And then finally, with the internalization, the really only way to get out of this is things like self-care. And again, while you can't self-care your way out of a systemic issue, self-care can help. Oop, I keep going too far. So after we did the survey and after we had our interviews with people, we had a national forum. Attendees participated in a 3-day design sprint where they worked up to come up with ideas for the issue and creating a prototype around their team's idea. So with this, we made sure that we had a variety of identities and positions represented there. So we tried to have kind of a diverse pool of people. And with that, they were given information from the survey and focus group, as well as a literature review to help kind of provide the shared background and the shared understanding of looking at this traumatic kind of problem we're having. So these are some of the projects, and I want to talk over them kind of briefly. So this was kind of the result of many iterations. We had people come up with good ideas, bad ideas, scrap them, come up with different, pitches, pitch to other people, get feedback. And these are kind of the final ideas we came with at the end of this 3-day sprint. So the first is a trauma support network, which is the idea is to create in-person and online peer-mediated support networks. This kind of idea is to help with isolation and providing support, especially when instances happen. The next is idea for an accreditation system. It's to have a system to signal what libraries are trauma friendly or are responding well to traumatic instances in the library. It would be something that would have to continually be accredited for. I know you had the speaker the other day on sustainability in libraries, and I think they have a kind of accreditation, something kind of similar to that. The next group, which says REST, their idea is to create policies and procedures that are baked into library documents. They're not a separate thing, but part of the library. And I do want to actually read a part of it because I really like it. They created a mission statement, and I really appreciate the mission statement. They wrote, REST holds an unwavering commitment to a culture of healing. We support our staff in continuous growth and recovery from trauma and its impacts. We honor the many challenges they face in their work. We recognize the effort, time, dedication, and energy they invest into uplifting our organization and community. We hold sacred the emotional, physical, and psychological safety of our staff members. We continuously move away from toxic culture that expects sacrifice. We move towards the bright future of mutual respect, action for change, open dialogue, and a flattening of power differentials. We celebrate the diversity of our staff and life experience they bring to enrich our lives and provide us with wisdom in our service. We are dedicated to a workforce of thriving individuals, so we may also have a community that thrives. So I just really liked how they kind of worded that. I think that's a great way to word a commitment to your library staff. The next one is Do We Do That? And they decided to come up with a database to link community organizations to libraries. So this takes the onus off the library to provide resources and instead highlights what others are doing. This would be something that would be co-maintained and co-created between the different community organizations as well as with the library. And the final one that just says administration really big, their idea was to bridge the gap between administration and frontline staff by having embedded management and communication structures to kind of break down that divide between management and between staff. And that kind of goes both ways. It's management seeing what frontline staff are doing and experiencing, but also the other way back where frontline staff also understand what managers are dealing with. So with this, there aren't really any clear heroes in this study. Everybody at all levels need to do better. We need to do a better job taking care of our coworkers. We need to do a better job taking care of our libraries, our communities, and our staff. So this is something, again, it is a systemic issue. It's at all levels. And so everybody needs to do better. After the forum, we had some recommendations. Some of these might seem familiar to you. The first one is a national worker helpline where workers can call for immediate help during mental health crisis and burnout. Another recommendation we have that would be useful is creating a set of standards for healthy work environments built by worker-led library organizations. So a lot of what we were looking at here were things that were worker-led and for workers by workers, because there is kind of a level of, you kind of don't know what it's like until you're in it. The next is a collection of policies and procedures written from the perspective of trauma-informed leadership. These policies, the idea is that they be written with kind of a plug-and-play structure so that they could be disseminated widely and libraries could just take them and use them in their own policies, so they wouldn't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. And then the final one is a series of peer-led support groups made up of library workers. So allowing workers at all levels to receive support from colleagues who can empathize and understand. And these would be kind of online where people could also opt into groups that match their interests, their issues, their level of work. So for like this, we could have, one page for administrators, one page for pages, also different kind of affinity groups for like workers of color, workers with disabilities, et cetera, so that you can talk to people who are in kind of the same space you are. So we also did just apply for an IMLS grant to start to implement some of these things. We're looking at implementing a library worker helpline, I think is the first one we're going to start with. We got through the first part of the IMLS grant, and so now we have to fill out the full grant. So if you can, keep your fingers crossed for us, because the purpose of the study was not just to come up with suggestions, but also to start to implement them, so we can have these at a national level and support library workers. So I also want to just talk about, I know that this study was primarily done with public librarians who are in urban settings. However, when we debuted this at ALA, as we kind of assumed, but it was nice to have it validated, we had many people, school librarians, academic librarians, library workers at different levels of, urban, suburban, rural, all talking about how this resonated, or how this resonated with them. And that was just really, it was great to hear that our study was more than just urbans, but it was also heartbreaking because it's hard to see that this is happening everywhere. We weren't surprised, but that was definitely validated at ALA through our different conversations. So with that being said, I'm actually from Chicago area initially, so I know a little bit about Wisconsin. One of the things I was challenged with by Wild Wisconsin was also to talk about this a little bit in the rural context of rural libraries. So with this, I did some research. I, looked up articles and things that I could. And the main challenges that I saw in rural libraries were things that I think many libraries have, but I do think it's exacerbated by just being in a smaller library, are things like staffing issues, a lack of public resources to rely on. So while an urban library may have these community connections that can be made, that may be harder in a rural situation. Politics, just things, we're seeing all these book challenges, and like I mentioned before, drag story times have kind of come under fire, and just the politics and the different politics that may be challenging the library and what the library stands for. Also things like funding, so having a certain amount of resources, staff, having opportunities for continuing education and support, just due to the nature of having less staff, having less peer support, less people you can turn to who understand the experiences you're having. Succession planning may cause lack of may cause kind of, jumps from library administrator to library administrator. Lower pay. I think pay is a problem in all libraries kind of everywhere. I think we all need to get paid more, especially as we're doing more work and more emotional work. But especially in rural libraries, I found this to be the case. And then also potentially living in the community you work. I think that makes it a lot harder to make boundaries and distinctions between the workplace. I also think it's a lot harder then to, once you close that library door to leave work at work, the likelihood of you getting stopped at the grocery store, for example, is much higher. So I also am just curious, what did I miss? If anybody here works in a rural library, in the chat or the Q&A, if you prefer to be anonymous, please let me know what I missed about rural libraries and share your story with me. I'd really appreciate that. I did have, and I'll have this in the slides that will be shared, I do have kind of some further resources for rural libraries. I found a really great toolkit on burnout that's worth checking out. Burnout and trauma are related. A lot of times trauma can cause burnout. And then also just some readings. Some of these are just general readings about rural public libraries, but there are some articles on, the problems of rural libraries and library directors. I also really liked this day in the life that kind of gave a rundown of a rural library. So while if you're a rural librarian, this may be really familiar to you, I also hope it can validate and kind of, we can kind of find that peer support electronically, that to know that other people are going through the same thing. I also just have further readings on trauma, burnout, mental health in general. Trauma-informed approach to libraries by Tolley is good. Whole person librarianship. I really like Trauma Stewardship by Lipinski. It talks a lot about that secondary trauma element. I did put the Body Keep score on here. I do want to acknowledge that this has kind of come under fire recently. It is a book that talks a lot about trauma and does have some really great trauma information. However, there is really heavy white supremacist elements to it because it talks about the misconduct of American soldiers, but then frames them as the victim, which is kind of gross. And also the author is accused of sexual misconduct. So with that, there are better books. Trauma Keep Score has been very, very big and out there, but some other suggestions to replace it are things like My Deepest Well, My Grandmother's Hands, What My Bones Know, and Trauma and Recovery. So I wanted to offer some substitutions there. And then I also just put at the bottom things that I'm reading. I can't talk about if it's good or bad because I'm still working on it, but I am really excited. There is a book on academic librarian burnout coming out, or came out 2 days ago, that I'm excited to read. So with that, I just want to give the contact information. You can find the contact here for ULU. You can find the website and the email. You can also contact me at Twitter, at Leah Librarian, at LinkedIn, or at my email. I'm also the person to contact if you want this presentation to be given anywhere else. Please reach out to me. And like I said before, if you are watching this after the fact and you want to have a discussion or you have a question, please feel free to email me or contact me through any of these ways, and I'm happy to talk about that with you. So with this, like I said, I wanted to open a big part of this to discussion and to questions, just because I think that's just a good use of our time. So if Leah doesn't mind stopping the sharing, or not sharing, recording,